I want to thank everybody for coming today. This is a historical occasion in that it's the first time people from Bethesda Naval Hospital who participated in the autopsy of President Kennedy have had an opportunity to talk with medical witnesses from Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, where President Kennedy died. They will have an opportunity to compare notes. After this filming is finished, they will have a chance to talk some more. But it is gravely important because we have the chance to try to resolve some of the unanswered questions about these wounds and their appearance. And they will also have an opportunity, some of them for the first time, to observe copies of the autopsy photographs, which were never shown to them by the official commissions. And so they were never able to comment on whether or not the wounds looked as they do in these photographs and x-rays. So we would like to begin with some of the people from Parkland, and in the future I hope that this will be almost a pilot so that at some future date we can try to bring every witness together from Bethesda Naval Hospital with every witness from Parkland before more people die, so that there's an opportunity to make a historical record that will last for all time before it's lost to us, because we all know that the official investigations covered up a great many things and distorted things, lied about things, and there have been many sensationalist books and theories put out that have distorted this record, and in particular what the wounds look like and what these pictures tell us and what it all means. So hopefully today we can get some answers. So I would like to start. All right, first of all, this is Floyd Reeve, who was the medical photographer. Will you tell us briefly what your position was and what you did that day?
Well, my name is Floyd Reeve. I was a medical photographer stationed at Bethesda, Maryland.
And what did you do?
Well, I was in the autopsy room taking photographs.
And this is Paul O'Connor.
My name is Paul O'Connor. I assisted on the autopsy of the president that night at Bethesda, Maryland.
And what are you doing now,
I'm retired.
Okay, Pam?
My name is James Jenkins, James C. Jenkins. I participated and assisted in the autopsy the same as Paul. At that time I was in the military, and I was a student there in the medical technology.
What was your function in the autopsy?
I assisted Dr. Humes. Basically what I did was I stayed within earshot of Dr. Humes, Dr. Boswell, Dr. Fink, to assist them in whatever they needed to do at that point in time, to remove the organs and so forth.
I'm Dr. Philip E. Williams, Jr. I'm a neurological surgeon in private practice here in Dallas. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, I was an intern at Parkland Hospital and was in the emergency room area at the time the president was being treated.
And what was your function in the room?
Actually, that particular day, when he first came in, I was in a medicine conference directly above the emergency room, and we heard the pages. Immediately I went downstairs in the emergency room, and I was there next to Mrs. Kennedy and offered her a chair to sit and something to drink while the activities going on in the room where the president was. At that, after everything was completed and he had been pronounced dead, Nurse Pat Hutton asked that I obtain a cover, mattress cover, which I did from up on the surgical ward up on 2, and brought it back down to the emergency room, and the president was placed in this mattress cover and then placed into a coffin.
I'm Audrey Bell, RN. At the time of the Kennedy assassination, I was the supervisor of operating rooms and recovery rooms at Parkland Memorial Hospital. Earlier that week, and a few days prior to that, I had been administratively covering the emergency room because the supervisor there was on vacation, although she did end up coming in on that fateful Friday. So when we got the word, my immediate reaction was to go to the emergency room to see what the emergency room staff would need, to lend them what assistance I could. And then, as it evolved, we had a larger problem that had to be taken care of upstairs in surgery with Governor Conley. So my attention focused to the second floor of surgery then after we saw that there was nothing more that surgically we could do for the president that day, after he was pronounced dead by Dr. Clark. Right now I'm retired, enjoying it.
My name is Dr. Robert McClellan, and at the time of the assassination, I was an assistant professor of surgery at Southwestern Medical School in Parkland. And that day, I was in the operating room on the second floor when I was told that the president had been brought in to the emergency room. And I immediately went down the back elevator to the trauma room where the president was and entered the room, and there was already a large crowd of people there. And I immediately went to the head of the table where Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter were beginning a tracheostomy, and they had already made the incision. I went to the head of the table, stood at the head of the table, and held a retractor while Dr. Perry completed the tracheostomy. At the present time, I'm still on the faculty at Southwestern Medical School. I'm a professor of surgery there.
My name is Aubrey Wright, and I was employed at O'Neill Funeral Home as an ambulance driver at the time of the shooting. I was stationed at the time at the emergency desk, had a patient that we had picked up on Houston Street and across from the assassination site. And we was in the process of getting him rested in to find out which room we was to take him to when they brought the president in. I'm now a police officer at Highland Park Police Department.
Dr. McClellan, when you first saw the body, did you examine the throat wound?
I didn't examine it because Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter were in the process at that time of putting the tracheostomy in, so I was not able to do anything more than see it rather cursorily while I held the retractor, but I could see the size of the wound.
The pre-existing wound before they...
Not the pre-existing wound. They had already opened through that wound, as I was told, and enlarged it to put in the tracheostomy tube, so I did not see the original wound.
Was it a cuff, sort of the tube part of a cuff?
It was a standard tracheostomy tube.
Yeah, but it had a sort of cuff that would have had to go
Right.
in this. And this photograph, which is Exhibit D, could you examine it and then hold it to the camera? Does that look like the incision that was made by Dr. Perry and Dr. Baxter?
This is the incision, and that does look like the incision that I saw that day. It had been enlarged at the time the tube was being put in. It may be somewhat longer than usual, but at that time it was not unusual at all in haste of putting in a tracheostomy tube for an incision to be that length. Sometimes they were made vertically, but in other events they were made transversely and of this size as this one was.
And would you say that the length of that wound is about exactly or not exactly what you recall at the time?
I'd say it's the same length.
All right. These little marks on the chest right here, do they mean anything to you?
No, I didn't see them as I recall at the time.
Do you recall the tubes, drainage tubes being inserted in the chest?
I really don't. I know from being told that they were, but I don't recall. I was concentrating on that, and I think they had drapes around here, and so I didn't see that.
Here's one more view of the tracheostomy, and if any others would like to comment on it. From the side, this is Exhibit F. Does that look square with your recollections of the throat wound.
Yes, here's the incision here, and I think that does that is consistent with the front view of the wound.
In some hospitals they would make a vertical wound. Is that correct? But in an instance like this, it would be normal to make an incision from left to right.
That's correct. Not unusual.
I'm not trying to put words in your
No,
mouth.
that's correct.
Okay.
That's what was done here.
And I want to, as all of us know, there's been an enormous dispute about this head wound, and there's a lot of problems with the photographs. Some of it's cut off on the left side of the head here in this particular print, but there's been a great deal of dispute about how accurately this picture might show the back of the head. We have with us the medical photographer who took it, men from the autopsy, who have insisted that these pictures are completely inaccurate and that they do not represent anything that they saw at the autopsy. There have been suppositions that there might have been some flap of scalp that might have been pulled over part of the large defect. But first of all, if you could just mention what you remember of the large defect in the head, which has been typified as an exit wound. And I know you've been asked to do this 100 times, and you brought this drawing which shows it, which we'll show to the camera. And the autopsy report stated that there was quote, an actual absence of scalp and bone in this area, which all the Parkland doctors wrote extended into the occipital area, into the parietal area. And but if everybody who saw this wound, if you could again put your hand on the area of the head, whether it was here or here or here, and show it to the camera, and then we'll talk about this photograph and whether or not there was such a flap of scalp or there was a supposition that all the reports said it was so macerated and shredded, and there was an actual patch. One of you described at the autopsy when the head was filled with plaster and the scalp that remained was pulled back over the skull. Then what happened? What remained or what was not covered over?
There was once at the autopsy in the area basically where Dr. McClellan had indicated in his drawing, there was an area approximately the size of, for reference purposes, of a $50 or a silver dollar that still had bone and scalp missing.
You draw it on the Okay, and would you restate that, please?
Yes. Okay, you just, well, basically in this area, there was an area approximately this size, the entire wound encompassed, just in general, as well as I can remember, the area here.
The large defect.
Yeah. And can you pick this up?
Okay, we'll enlarge this a little bit. This area, when the head came in, you say was opened up.
Yes, the tissue was attached, and the scalp was attached to bone fragments, and in all of this area. There was a large fragment in this area that could be laid back and was attached. Yes, similar to this. I would say that's probably the flap that was being discussed. And that's about the only similarity that I can say that I remember to this photograph.
So you say that there's something wrong with this photograph?
I think there's something wrong with that photograph because after the plaster was placed by the mortician or the cosmetologist in the head, it was remolded, and the problem with the right eye was basically solved, not to everybody's satisfaction, but was solved. There was an area in the back of the head there was actually a hole in the back of the head that was approximately the size of a silver dollar. Now, we did receive bone fragments in a small baggie type thing along with some bullet fragments, and those were tried to fit to this area. The scalp had been brought down prior to this, and these bone fragments had tried to fit them into the area. There were still some small fragments of bone that were missing. They could not completely cover the area. I would like to kind of reverse a little bit and go back to what the wound looked like when we actually took the towels off the head at the initial. And the wound was a massive type of wound where it was an open gaping wound, approximately the size, I would say this, again for reference, approximately the size of a closed fist or maybe a little larger. More similar to what Dr. McClellan states in his drawing. I think that perception may make the difference between how I remember the wound as far as the area that it was in. I remember the wound a little higher than maybe the drawing, but again, too, I think that's irrelevant at this point. Let me see if I can orientate myself to this.
Do you see if there's a neckline here?
Yeah.
And
okay.
the
This.
ears were here, on the top of the head.
Okay. I think that this is probably an extended photograph. It looks like after the brain has been removed from the cavity.
This is Exhibit H.
Okay. I'm not sure, as I said, as to what time and when this was taken. But again, there was a massive wound at this point in time. It was a wound in such that the scalp and the skin could be drawn back over it and closed off. So,
But not entirely.
No,
Was there enough
not
scalp to cover it entirely?
there was enough scalp with bone fragments or skull fragments to cover it to a certain extent, but there was still approximately some areas missing. If I'm orientated right, in this area, that was approximately the size of a silver dollar or half dollar.
Could you put your hand on the back of your head and face the camera backwards, showing us where that large hole was?
Okay.
Sorry.
The whole wound extended basically, if I place the palm of my hand a little superior and anterior to the ear, encompassed even the circle of the fingers. Approximately in this area was where the final hole was, after everything had been drawn back and the body had been prepared for burial.
And do you recall any men from the autopsy actually putting a fist inside or putting both fists inside like this?
No, really not.
But you say it was large enough to put a fist in.
Yes.
And all right, let's go back to Dr. McClellan, and then I would like to ask you some more questions. Okay, a couple more questions. Dr. McClellan, does all this square with your memory in terms of you said, and again, I don't want to ask a leading question, and I don't want to, you know what you saw. So in our original interviews in 1979, you stated that that the scalp was so badly shredded in the back that it would have been impossible really to cover over that large defect.
That's correct, to do it completely. I might just preface my remarks by saying that the way the wound is described by Mr. Jenkins, I think squares very well with what I saw. And I might further add that I think maybe the reason the wound in my drawing there might look a little bit smaller than the wound as it's drawn on the mannequin is that I was seeing the wound when there was a great deal of matted hair and blood around the edges of it, and I probably couldn't appreciate the entire periphery, the size of it, as Mr. Jenkins could at the autopsy table. But it certainly squares with the general location and the general appearance and configuration of the wound. Insofar as that scalp flap is concerned, that's probably the part of the head wound that I'm least certain about, and that is that while the scalp was certainly macerated and covered with blood and matted hair, I really couldn't tell exactly what percentage of the scalp was missing or still present over the wound. And when I was presented these pictures in Washington, when was it, about 3 years ago, one of the
National
pictures,
Archives.
right, where the flap is being pulled forward apparently over the skull, it was my assumption at that time, and that's all it was, is an assumption, is that there was enough of the flap left to pull up over the back portion of the wound and to hide the back portion of the wound and the front portion of the wound, not because it was covering the front portion of the wound, but simply from the camera angle, it didn't permit that part of the wound to be seen.
Does this picture look familiar to you?
This
terms
is
of
the
what you
picture
said?
that I was speaking of just now, and you can see the autopsy prosector pulling the scalp forward. And
Or
I
le-
suppose
Excuse me, that, or at least that is what you would
that's
be
what
led
I'm
to
assuming.
believe.
That's my assumption.
It's
right.
an assumption.
It's an assumption. And I assume that the scalp was being pulled forward at the autopsy, and that this was a flap of scalp that was laid back. That's again another
Yeah.
assumption. And that this was being pulled forward over the wound. Did not mean to me that there was not this gaping wound underneath it. I think one might be led to believe, if you didn't know all the circumstances, that this was intact head back here,
That the skull was in place.
that the skull was in place, and that's not the case. The skull was missing underneath this portion of the scalp.
And I realize that none of you are photographic experts, although you may have that as a hobby or whatever, but does anything seem strange about that photograph to you? Any part of it out of focus, or it's not the best copy, and I apologize.
I really can't say, Mr. Livingston.
Do you see anything that might be alleged to be an entry wound in the back of the head there?
Well, I can see down here something. I couldn't venture to say what it was.
Do you recall years ago when I sent you the Warren Commission, the autopsy report published by the Warren Commission, where they placed an alleged entry wound in the back of the head?
Yes, I knew that from other sources as well as what you had told me that was said to be the case.
And where would
My own personal knowledge of it, I didn't see anything that looked like
But
that.
from the autopsy report, where was it? It was
Well, as I recall, it was probably about in this area, although my picture of it, right or wrong, was perhaps that it was a little more to the right.
Yeah, that's right. The autopsy doctors stated to the House committee that so-called brain tissue there was where there was an entry wound.
Right. Perhaps here, maybe is what I would have thought that it would be.
Yeah. Now, did you gentlemen, you had an opportunity, you spent several hours with the body and with the head, removed what remained of the brain and so on. Do you recall any talk of an entry wound in the back of the head, or did you see an entry wound? Did you probe an entry wound with a pencil or a probe, metal probe or anything?
No.
I'm speaking of a small bullet hole
No.
in the back of it. Are you absolutely certain?
Yes.
I'm certain of, again, to say what I observed. To further this, I was surprised that recently I had read the Warren Commission report, and I was surprised at the description of supposedly a smaller bullet wound below the large extrusion, or the larger wound. I did not see that. It's possible that it was there and that I didn't see it, but I spent most of the night probably less than 3 or 4 feet from the doctors, because again, my duty was to assist them whenever they needed it, so I had to be within earshot. I was away from the head approximately, 30 to 45 minutes when Dr. Boswell and I did the remainder of the autopsy by taking the organs out, sectioning them, weighing, so forth. I remember, and I don't want to get too rapidly into this because I'm hoping that everything else will develop it, but I remember conversations and so forth when the brain was removed. In my mind, I remember what the brain looked like. In that aspect, I have some questions I'd like to ask Dr. Williams.
All right. Did you participate in removing the brain?
Participate in that I actually, no, I was standing, it's kind of hard to describe. I was standing at shoulder length, or from the president's shoulder on the right side. The brain was being removed by Dr. Humes. Dr. Boswell was on the outside, Dr. Fink was inside. And the comment that came back to me was that the brainstem is severed, or the brainstem is severed. And then there was speculation as to whether this had been done by a bullet or not. They extended, if I remember my anatomy, the sagittal suture a little bit instead of doing a skull cap to pull the brain out. My first impressions of the brain was that, first of all, it was a small brain. This was just an impression. But again, I have to clarify that with the fact is that when I saw the president on the table, again, he looked smaller than I anticipated, and I think that's perception of his status as opposed to his physical aspects. The brain was taken by Dr. Boswell, myself, and taken to a stainless steel bucket that we had rigged with a gauze sling. And we also had an apparatus that was extended to a formalin bottle and with 2 needles attached to it. And what we would do is that we would take an H-shaped vein plexus underneath, and if I again remember correctly, this is called the bundle of His. And we would insert needles in branches of that, tie them off with surgical suture, and we would leave it that way. The gravity would infuse the interior part of the brain, and we would leave it usually until the autopsy ended, and then we would drop it into the formalin in the bucket, and it would be kept for the brain conference on Mondays. I had written down, well...
Do you want?
No, we're going to stay with that.
All right.
Okay.
Let's pick it up where you were about describing your taking the brain and putting it in a stainless steel container.
Okay. The brain, again, was placed in a stainless steel container. When I left the morgue the next morning about 9 o'clock, to the best of my knowledge, it was still in that container. And the brain was not weighed, which was not an unusual procedure because, again, at brain conference, they reweighed the brain and they thoroughly dissected them and so forth. So usually on our cover sheets, we did not put the weight of the brain. We weighed the heart, the lungs.
Did you have a weight for that brain?
No, we did not have a weight for the brain.
Would you estimate what the weight was?
Really, I would say, like, I don't really, relate to grams or so forth. I think the brain was apparently a normal-sized brain. It had, and again, I wanted to ask Dr. Williams about some statements that were made that said that part of the cerebellum was hanging through the scalp wound. The brain that I saw basically had the cerebellum intact. There was a large portion of the cerebellum in the occipital parietal temporal area that was gelled. It was kind of like jelly, and there was some of the brain missing. But
how much brain, if you started with 100% or fractions, let's say half or an eighth, or how much of the brain would you say remained?
I would say the major portion of the brain remained. It was, certainly more than 2/3, and I would say probably about 3/4 of the brain was still there and intact.
Mm-hmm. But it was severed from the brainstem.
Yes, and the resolution, they never resolved the question as to whether it had been severed by a bullet or so forth. My observation when we turned the brain over to infuse it was that the vessels were retracted as if they had been cut at some previous time, and the brain stem itself had about a 2/3 incision and had been incised about 2/3 through. And the other third had basically been, pulled out. and to me, at that point, and again,
Blasted out, perhaps?
no, it really wasn't. It looked like a clean surgical incision. It looked as if it had been cut surgically.
Do you have the idea that, would it be possible that this brain had been put into the head before you got the body?
That would only be speculation. And
But was it possible?
well, again, we're talking in those terms. Anything is possible. I would have to assess probability as an unknown factor.
Dr. McClellan or Dr. Williams, what is the average weight of the average person's brain, would you say?
1,300, maybe 1,600 grams.
The autopsy report stated, a supplemental autopsy report stated that the president's brain weighed 1,500 grams. Now, from the blast described by yourself in your reports in 1963 and all the other witnesses at Parkland who stated a good third, if I'm not mistaken, is that right, of the brain had been blasted out by the time you saw it. You saw a large hollow.
That was one of my clearer impressions, was that horrible-looking gaping wound that extended not only over the surface of the skull, but was a cavity down into the head. And as I stood there holding the retractor, I was looking all the time right down into it. I was no more than 18 inches away from the wound all the time, standing just above it. So I had a continuing impression of that gaping cavity throughout the entire time I was standing there, which was several, I guess, 10 to 15 minutes at least. And during that time, in the early part of that time, I had a kind of a peripheral impression early on that a portion of what appeared to me strongly to be the cerebellum fell backward through the wound onto not onto the table, but onto the scalp and the hair that was hanging back from the head. Whether it fell completely free and loose or not, I don't know, but it fell back out of the wound into my field of vision.
Dr. McClellan, I'd like to, and Audrey, I'm sure you remember this also, but I regret that we don't have all the other doctors and nurses here, but every single doctor and nurse that wrote their report or testified to the Warren Commission stated that the cerebellum was lost or blasted out, and that was coming out of the head. This was later revised by some witnesses after seeing some of this alleged autopsy photographs and so on. But correct me if I'm wrong, didn't everyone say that the cerebellum was, as you have said, either damaged or missing?
That was my strong impression.
And yes, sir.
As I've said, I did not see the wound, but I was told, and literally the way it was described, that the cerebellum was swinging in the breeze. Basically, it was
hanging out.
That's right. It was hanging out.
I was also told, and again, this is purely hearsay, not what I saw, that Mrs. Kennedy, when she first came in, was holding a piece of the president's brain in her hand.
Yeah. Now, how does this memory of the cerebellum, what they're describing with hanging out and swinging, how does this square with what all of you remember?
To me, it's not congruent with what was seen. The other impression I had was that the damage to the brain was not, really did not match the damage to the skull or to the wound as we first saw it when we unwrapped the head. It was, again, and I made a statement once before. And it was purely a actually it was purely a first impression. The brain was a small brain, and for some reason, and I apologize to Ms. Bell, it came into my mind that it was a female brain. Now, I don't really know why that came about. Okay, I know I would definitely be in trouble, but again, too, is that I think my impression that I can solidly state is the fact is that the brain did seem to be small. clarifying that with the fact is that my impression initially of the body was that he was a much smaller man than I anticipate seeing. The brain that I saw and that I actually helped infuse was not damaged to the extent that you would have expected. There was a small portion of it missing in the appropriate area, but the rest of it seemed to be more traumatized. In other words, it seemed to be gelled. It was a very soft, brain tissue from what I've seen. As it's traumatized, it gets real soft and mushy and that type of thing. And of course, as death occurs, again, you would be able to answer that better than I. But
I'm going to continue to ask a few questions, and then you can all question each other a little more. But Floyd, do you have any knowledge of how that brain looked?
Well, from what I can remember, I didn't see much of it at all when we took the pictures of the back of the head when the president was in
Did you take
it.
pictures before the brain was removed?
Yes.
Inside the head? Like, does this look familiar to you, this picture?
That does, yes.
Did you take this picture?
I was either myself or Mr. Stringer.
All right.
One of the two, yes.
And do you remember anything about the cerebellum?
No.
Paul?
What I remember of the wound was a little bit bigger than what Jim has put down there. I remember extending a little bit further.
There's a red pen there.
Okay. A little bit further out like this.
Okay. And did you see it when it was put back together, when the plaster was put in there?
Yes.
And how does this square with what you recall?
Well, that's what I recall too, is there was that part missing.
In the back. You want to turn it toward the camera? Okay.
That
Which part was missing?
This part was missing.
There was no scalp there. Would you say it was a little larger than that, though?
I remember it being about a little bit larger than a silver dollar.
Yeah. So that's somewhat accurate, you would
Yes.
say. Or pretty accurate.
Yes.
Pretty accurate. Floyd, can I have this picture? Does this picture look familiar to you?
You showed it to me a couple, 3 days ago.
Yeah. I mean, is this? Did you take a picture of the back of the head?
Yes, I did.
Before the autopsy began?
Yeah.
And what did the head look like when you took the
Well,
picture of it?
similar to the one down here, except the hair was not this one.
Picture,
Right
this
here.
one?
No.
This one?
Yeah.
The one where the scalp is
Right.
reflected
But
back.
the scalp was
This is
not
age.
reflected back when I took the first pictures.
Yeah. It was not reflected back.
No.
So
not the first
what
time.
you have here is this similar, except for a lot of macerated scalp
Right.
on the head here.
Yeah.
Okay. What is this picture? What could it be? I mean, was it taken after the head was put back together? Was it?
That's a possibility, or somebody's dreaming about it. I don't know what, but that's not what I saw.
Is this what you saw? No. Is this? Do you think this picture is fake or
I believe it is. I believe it's a paste up.
composite picture?
Yeah, composite type
Do you,
picture.
as a photographer, do you know how do they make a composite?
Well, first off, you have to have the pictures that you want to put together. Then you start etching them out, tape them together, glue them together, press them, rephotograph them, retouch the negatives, and then you can go ahead and reprint them again.
All right.
As long as you get all the irregularities out.
The government claims that this picture demonstrates that the president was shot from behind, and when this was examined in 1967, there is an entry wound here. And Paul's pointed out that in some of the other photographs, such as Exhibit C, that it does not show in the colic area this wound here in the colic area, which in 1967 was discovered it was supposed to be an entry wound that the autopsy report placed near the head or near the hairline in the occipital protuberance. And then it had moved 4 inches up to the top. And Dr. Humes and Dr. Boswell, when they examined it before the House committee, said, well, I have a little trouble with the fact that this has moved 4 inches from where we placed it in the autopsy report. Yet all of the witnesses, the other men from the autopsy, say there was no entry wound in the back of the head there. Now, Floyd, if is some part of this, which parts of this picture are in focus, and is any part of it out of focus?
Yes, there is. It's strange because the part that is closest to the camera is in focus. The hand and working back on the arm where the focus decreases the further back you go. But then right down in here, if you look close enough, that's out of focus. The neck is in focus though.
So in other words, the foreground and the background
don't match.
Well, they're in focus.
Well, oh yeah, okay. The foreground and the background are in focus, but the prime
middle
area
the middle
is
ground.
not. The middle ground is not in focus.
Scientifically, is this possible?
Not with a camera, no.
So this is some
I
sort
mean,
of
if this was going to be in focus, and this is out of focus, everything away from that would be out of focus.
Do you folks have any comment to make about the wounds or your experience in this case? We have here an X-ray. Let me ask you, Dr. McClellan, I've got 100 questions all of a sudden. Dr. McClellan, this picture, is he coming back?
I think he had to go take a phone call.
Okay.
He was beeped a minute ago.
Okay. Dr. McClellan, you did okay this picture showing, you can show it to the camera.
Yes, this one.
Today, you still feel that this does or does not square with your memory of?
Yes, it does. As I said,
perhaps larger?
It may be somewhat larger than I've depicted it there, but I was not able to see, as well as the people at the autopsy, the full extent perhaps, but it's basically the same.
Next question, this X-ray, how would you interpret that? I realize you're not a radiologist.
No, I'm not a radiologist, but my impression of this is that this clearly shows a severe wound of the front part of the head, both from the front and from the side here. And that doesn't show any wound at all in the back, and it's just the opposite from what I saw and what I understand everybody else saw. The other thing is that my strong impression when I came into the room and first saw the president was that while his face was swollen and cyanotic, it was essentially intact. It's inconceivable to me that his face could be intact and not be greatly damaged if he had a wound in this area. So
Could you put your hand on your face where that defect, it would be a total defect in the bone?
This defect would be here, just the opposite of where I saw it back here.
And you made a comment to me in a private conversation after the Nova show to the effect of, I can't understand why this would be missing unless they were trying to cover something up. Does that square with, do you agree with that statement? Or
yes.
Did you say that?
Yes.
Would the face, now here we have photographs.
Did the doctor restate that statement?
Would you want to ask me that question again?
Why would those x-rays show such a total defect of bone in the front of the head like this, on the right?
Well, I think that if he had this sort of injury to the bone, there would have been a great deal of damage to this portion of the face and the forehead. And I did not see that at all. He had no damage to his face except for some slight swelling and cyanosis.
Is there any way that that bone could have fallen in and not show there on the x-ray?
No.
It looks completely blasted out to you?
Right.
All right, these photographs of the face, I'm going to ask all of you this, and I might state, I'm not trying to ask a leading question, but every witness said that there was no damage to his face. It might have been a little swollen or whatever. But these photographs of the face, do they square with your memory, Audrey? And then we'll talk to you gentlemen.
Yes. The face was intact because I remember the scalp back over, and I believe it was Dr. Perry, or it could have been you, lifted it up to show me the hole when I came in. The face was intact because my first question is, where's the injury?
Do you recall Dr. Buddy Giseki
Buddy Gieseke,
lifting up the head and shining a flashlight in the hole in the back?
he could have been done it. He was in the room.
Yes.
But I don't recall that. But there wasn't the facial injury.
So do these photographs showing the face, do they square with your memory? Excuse me.
Yes, yes.
You would say that there was no damage to any part of the face or any side outside of the temple or hairline or anywhere in here. There's no damage.
I didn't note any damage in the front.
No,
And
Do all
other
these
than
pictures-
just, with the trach, this being enlarged for the trach, that was all that was in the front.
And these photographs showing the face and the one that Dr. McClellan is holding, do they square with your memory? Was there any damage to the face when you saw the body?
No.
No.
Is there any way that the face without that bone would still remain intact here and stand up looking quite normal here without all of this bone back here?
I don't see how.
No.
It would have
Lying
fallen
on his
in.
back.
no.
In
No
your
way.
experience with working at funeral homes, many bodies, some of you, in Vietnam, it doesn't make any sense to you that with all this frontal bone missing, that the face would not have fallen in
It
and
would have been
somewhat.
completely deformed.
Pardon?
It would have been completely deformed.
Right.
Al, could you describe when you the head was in towels when you were putting it into the coffin, what it felt like to you?
It was mushy. You could feel the pieces of the bone sticking in the hand, but it was real mushy type, real
What part?
spongy.
What part of the head?
Well, we, lift his head up here, and then we have to put a hand underneath his
Yeah.
neck here to keep his head straight when we pick him up.
Uh-huh.
But right back here was real mushy when we picked him up.
Al, could you describe the scene from the time that the body was prepared for the coffin? I believe it was washed. Was that right, Audrey?
Well, it would have been cleaned up partially. However, you didn't do too much cleaning up because medical examiner, you couldn't wash away evidence.
Right.
So the medical examiner never liked to have a body totally cleaned up before they got him. You sent everything intact with all IV tubes, chest tubes, any drains, anything that's been attached, go intact.
I did notice some cut down. We were looking at
That's
these.
right, just cut off so that they don't.
Were any of the chest tubes in?
No tubes was in. They'd already washed the body and cleaned up all the sheets and everything was on the floor. But his head, if I remember, was wrapped completely in a bed-type sheet. It wasn't towels.
It wasn't towels?
No.
Okay.
Trauma was above here, so there wouldn't have been a lot of blood and tissue or what have you on the lower part of the body. It would have been primarily confined to above the shoulders.
But I did notice a trach was a lot larger than normal trachs I've seen done at Parkland. And if you don't mind, you're looking at this man's head here, and his head is pulled back, which would make the wound look a lot bigger.
Yeah.
When he was laying on the cot, his head was flat with his body. But the trach was more of a jagged, as you can see right here. It has a little jagged part right here, which
Did
to
you
me
tell it
looked
been
more
shot
like
in the throat?
it looked like an exit or an entrance wound to a gunshot, and I've seen several gunshots.
Yeah.
And normally when doctors at Parkland did trachs, they cut down this way instead of across, which seemed a little unusual. That's the only wound that we could actually see outside of the cut downs on it that they'd done.
Dr. Williams, were you asked to bring a wrapping of some kind to put around the body in order to put it in the coffin?
Yes, at the time, while the president was being cared for in Trauma Room 1, I was just outside the door, keeping in mind I was an intern at the time. And I was standing next to Mrs. Kennedy, and she was in a folding chair that we had provided. And then after he had been pronounced dead, and I can't remember now who came out and spoke with her, but Short while later, Pat Hutton, who was the nurse in the emergency room, opened the door and asked me if I would get a cover, and directed me to the one of the wards. And I went up to on the surgical ward up on 2 and obtained a plastic mattress cover, a whitish gray, as I recall.
Was it the type that go around a gurney mattress or?
No, this is for a regular full-size bed.
For a bed.
Full-size bed.
What color was it?
As I recall, it was kind of a whitish gray plastic, kind of a heavy plastic.
But it wasn't a dark, almost black color, dark green.
Not that I recall.
So what color was it? No,
it was a light color. I mean, either a gray or a white.
Opaque.
Did it have a zipper
Opaque.
around it?
Opaque.
Okay.
With a zipper probably
Did
around
it have
it.
a zipper around it?
Or did it?
I felt like it had an elastic that it would fold over, a form-fitting type of mattress.
And did it, lost my train of thought. Do you know if this is what was used to put on the body? You don't know.
Not with certainty, no. I brought it back down to the emergency room and then to the area of the trauma room 1,
Yeah.
and I opened the door and handed it to Pat.
It was plasticized or rubberized or?
Well,
Plastic.
I guess it
plastic.
was
Because
plastic.
we
It wasn't
no
a.
longer used the rubber ones then.
Okay.
It wasn't rubber. It was a plastic material.
This was a cover, mattress cover is what it was,
Yeah.
that was used over the mattress to protect the mattress when we had the patients in there.
Right.
We all hated them because they were that plastic stuff, and they'd bunch up under the patients, and now they plasticize the mattresses. But back then we had the plastic.
Al, could you tell the story then of what you helped wrap the body and put it in the coffin, and then there was a wait for the priest, and then you went in the hall, and there was a battle in the hall, and what Mrs. Kennedy did. Could you tell the story beginning from the time that wrappings were brought? First of all, there's these towels here in some of these pictures over the head. Do they look at all familiar? Were they from Bethesda Hospital, or do you think they were wrapped around the head at Parkland?
I can't tell by those pictures.
Looks like it.
No, I can't.
We didn't have towels like that.
I don't think we did.
We had white
Would
towels
these
and
would
green
these towels be from Bethesda
Back in them days, they
Hospital?
had Parkland had Parkland on the sheets to keep us from stealing them. I know that.
Yeah.
You know,
Do
they had it with
remember
them blue.
on the towels? I don't think we had them on the towels.
Was the
They
head
had the
wrapped in
sheet.
something?
They had the sheet because I noticed the blue Parkland markling on the sheet.
But we didn't have towels that had
Had a
the
stripe.
stripe on them. We had green towels in the operating room, and just plain white towels, primarily down in the emergency room.
That's my recollection.
Yeah.
We used green towels in the OR because we were in the process of switching over. We were beginning to do more telecasting and making film in the OR, so we'd gone to green linens, and that's the only place in the house.
And there was a
that
green
had
towel
those.
by Miss Kennedy where they had give her
Jim,
to
do you
wash the blood
remember
off of her and everything.
how the head was wrapped when it came in?
Yes, that was one of the reasons that I wanted to talk to Ms. Bell or someone. When it came into the morgue, now understanding that the body was apparently removed from the casket in an interim or an entranceway where the body boxes were. It came into the morgue, and the first time I saw it, it was on a gurney, and it was wrapped in sheets, and I'm not sure that it wasn't wrapped in something similar to a body bag, but again, I can't really definitely say that it was or wasn't. The body itself was wrapped in, I think, a couple of layers of sheets. The head was wrapped in a sheet, but underneath the sheet, it was wrapped in several bath-sized towels, but underneath those in the wound area were towels similar, a couple of towels similar to these. And that is something that
Would you typify those as something you'd find in a military hospital?
that was my impression.
Let me ask you a question. Are you familiar with the term laps?
Laps?
You know the muslin squares that we
Yeah,
use?
right.
Were they laps?
No, they were towels.
They were
And-
definitely towels.
Yeah, they were towels in this design. They were basically a very pale green towel with a dark green center. And
That was not a Parkland towel.
yeah, and the other thing was that And again,
you're absolutely certain that what he's describing was not.
We did not have green towels with a light stripe in them.
Also, this towel has a caduceus with the U.S.
military.
But we don't know that the head was wrapped in these towels.
No, I don't. No, the head was not wrapped in the towels that are displayed there for the simple reason that there's not enough blood on it.
There was a tremendous amount of blood on
We
on
had
the
green
sheet.
towels in surgery, and they were the
Darker green, somewhat darker.
yeah.
But
that-
you would have not sent those with the body that would have been changed, right?
No, and they had the white ones elsewhere. But also, were they towels or were they? Come on, what do we call them?
They were barber type towels.
They were what?
They were the small barber towels, and I think in the military we called them a shaving towel.
Okay.
It was not
Okay,
Douthit
because there
or
are
a
different
bath towel.
types, and that is the type that is used in the emergency room and OR for towels.
We had not, again, like I said, now it also was wrapped in a bath type towel. There were 2 bath type towels, if I remember correctly, and then a couple of these were underneath. We put all of the linen.
We didn't have that kind of linens even down in the emergency room, and I don't think that they would have sent
Al,
out.
maybe
This
you
is a
could,
terry cloth type.
Yeah,
you're saying.
that's the larger towels.
Right, and we have no terry cloth.
All right,
towel.
I
All the
guess they
towels I
call
saw down there were a smooth type towel, you know, not like your normal bath towel.
what color? White?
Well, they had a room directly across, well, not directly, but a room where we more or less had our stretcher in. That had different types of towels, sheets, and different types of linen in there. And I know that when they give Miss Kennedy a washcloth and a towel to wash the blood off of her, that it was a greenish color.
Well, I just,
And at any point, I encourage all of you to question
all
one
right,
another if you have
excuse me.
questions.
Let,
It would have been some of the nurses in the emergency room
yeah.
because
But
I was already
did Pat Hutton
I
help?
think she did help prepare.
She's denied it last night.
We had a nurse in there all
She
the
say
time.
she denied it?
Oh yeah, you
said
had
that,
2 or 3 nurses.
she
in
didn't
there for a
remember
while,
and that
or-
her
Green
public
is
statement
black.
was
But
the
there-
statement.
I think
Yeah.
Pat
She,
helped
that she
prepare the
didn't
body.
feel like
No,
that
we're
she
getting
should
ready to
get
put him in the
involved.
casket.
Okay, we're ready to start. So if you will ask,
Big pardon? Bronze color.
do you please ask the questions about the towels and the wrappings and the sheets?
Initially, when I talked to Mr. Livingstone about this, one of the questions I had was, who could I contact that had prepared the body? Unfortunately, one of the individuals has, in the interim, passed away. And then the other, I talked to Ms. Hutton, I guess probably several weeks ago, and discussed it with her. And again, there was no definitive answer as to whether she actually helped prepare it and so forth. And I was hoping that Ms. Bell would be able to clarify the things for me, because as I started going back over this, and I hadn't done this, I hadn't really reviewed it in my mind for several years, I remembered that as the body came into the morgue, it was taken from the gurney, put on the table, and the towel, not the towels, but the sheets were removed, and we were told not to remove the towels that were wrapping the head. I do remember a couple of people peeking under the towels. And one of the things, I remember that there was a clothes hamper or a laundry hamper type thing that was sitting back behind me. And I remember the towels initially being removed by Dr. Boswell and Dr. Humes, and were actually thrown up against the wall in the little corner. And then Dr. Stover, at a later time in the night, asked that they be put into a bag, along with the sheets and so forth. And they were put into primarily a garbage, what we would consider a garbage type bag. The question that I had basically at that time that I kind of lost grasp of later on that came back to me was, why would this type of towel be involved in the wrapping of the head? And I just kind of, again, started thinking, and I tried to remember if if in essence it did have something like the caduceus that was here, even though I don't think these are the type of towels. I mean, they're similar, but they're not the towels that I saw. If it might have something like, to be honest with you, U.S. Army or U.S. Navy written on them.
Did you see anything with U.S. Army written on it?
No, I did not. I don't remember seeing it. I do remember the description of the towels, and the towels were similar to what we had termed as a shaving towel.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
Did you hear, before the body actually came into the Bethesda, the loading dock and the morgue, did you hear that it was coming from Walter Reed Hospital from anybody?
No. Paul would be more involved in that than I was. Paul was involved in unloading the body from the coffin, bringing the body, placing it on the gurney and bringing it into the morgue. I was not involved in that. As a matter of fact, all I saw is that it came through the door, the large double doors into the atrium type was open, and I did see a casket come in. Now, I would like to state at this time, there was a ornate casket, maybe rosewood, that was already present in the lab at the time of the arrival. It had been brought in earlier. It had been placed there. I had asked. I was told that it was an Air Force major that was to be buried at Arlington the next day. Now, exceptions. In the military, everything is done by numbers and by the book. I was told it was not necessary to log it into the log, the morgue log, which was an extremely unusual circumstance. I didn't question it again. I'm an enlisted military individual and relatively young at the time, so I didn't really question that. It seemed strange and out of place, but I did not question it. Again, once the body was prepared, the casket was brought into the morgue and the body was placed in that. It was a very ornate, expensive-looking
Wooden casket.
Wooden. Definitely was wood, with brass accessories, handles, hinges, script, that type of thing. And as far, again, like I said, as to how the body first came into the morgue, how it ultimately left the morgue, Paul would be a little bit more familiar with that than I would, and I would have to defer those questions to him. As far as when it was in the morgue, when the autopsy was in process, I never, with the exception of when we infused the brain, I never was probably more than roughly 3 to 4 foot
away
from the body.
Uh-huh.
And
You say there was a coffin in the morgue?
yes, there was one already
This
in the
ornate
morgue.
coffin that you described?
It was in the cooler room.
It was in the cooler room.
Wouldn't that be unusual to have a coffin in the morgue?
Yes,
Yes.
it was very unusual.
But you were told it was an Air Force major that was in the coffin?
I was told that it was an Air Force major that was to be buried in Arlington the next day. And that
Aren't the bodies usually placed in the coffin in the funeral home?
Do they embalm at the?
Yeah, would you,
Well,
under normal circumstances, no. In this particular individual, after the autopsy was finished, there was a younger man that came apparently from one of the Boston funeral homes because, being young and so forth, we were impressionable. I remember him as a thin man with a bowler and with a vest, a three-piece suit, because I remember him taking a plastic apron out of one of the vest pockets and a pair of gloves out of the other vest pocket and taking the gray gloves he had on his hand and putting them in his bowler and setting them over with his umbrella, I guess it was. And to me, that was a rather unique thing. And then,
Funeral home in Boston?
Washington.
well, that was the impression I had. And the impression from where he was from was basically related to how he was dressed.
You look
When
like
was
a
that
Bostonian.
taken off?
Yes, well, he looked like a very, he did look like a Bostonian. I guess that would.
I have a lot of questions. Go ahead.
The president had his back brace on
How
when
high
he was
did
in
it
the
come on his
emergency
body?
room.
How high did that brace come on his body?
right through here. I don't think, we didn't take it off.
Somebody took
As
it off.
far as, I mean, I don't think they had taken it off while they were still
Do you
working.
remember the back brace?
Did
No.
you have
No.
a back brace?
was-
Then
he
it
didn't have
must
a
have
back
come
brace on,
off.
we took
Then
it.
they must
No.
have taken it off while they were
When we
preparing
received the body, there was no brace or any.
Because he
Quite
had
a, quite a few,
He had that back brace on earlier.
yeah, quite a few questions have arisen here now. I'm going to ask some quick ones, and then we'll try to concentrate more on these questions. But do any of you have a memory of someone saying or seeing or hearing one of the autopsy doctors beating on the head with a hammer before the autopsy began?
I don't.
I received a call from a person last year who stated
Was
No,
he stated was a doctor?
he was a doctor from around the Washington area that
There,
knew a
there
lot
is a
about
doctor
the
by
autopsy,
that name in that area, by the way.
and that the body was diverted to the emergency room, which is on the other side of the hospital from the morgue,
Yeah.
where he was a hammer was taken to the skull, and the wound was deformed. A
Now,
lot
in your
more.
examination of the skull, with quote comminuted fractures, would this in any way correspond to that type of damage, bearing in mind what a gunshot wound from a high-powered rifle would do?
No, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because if there was a hammer or a mallet taken to it, it would have left an impression of the edges
Something.
of the mallet. And when we open, or when Dr. Humes actually took the towels off of the head was a gaping mass of blood, hair, and so
All
forth.
macerated.
Yeah, and it was like,
And
well, I don't want to say macerated because that indicates that the bones were in small pieces and so ground that type. But it was a massive tangle of hair. The wound was gaping open at that point in time, and
I should remember to ask the brain size, but we want to finish the issue of the towels and is there any other question that you have, or have we?
No, I've covered the question I had about the small towels.
And so, do you feel that the body arrived in some sort of different wrappings or conditions or towels than it left Parkland?
Well, since I didn't see the body, I guess you're the only one here who actually saw it when it
Yeah.
was.
Well, the doctor here was talking about the mattress cover that he brought down. We wouldn't have been able to see the wound in his throat, trach in his throat if they had put him in a mattress cover. But one thing, Miss Kennedy come in, she took her wedding ring off, and we tried to get it on his finger. And one of the nurses got some K-gel type stuff from the cabinet in the trauma room there, and we greased the finger enough to get the ring up, just above the knuckle here. So he was not ever placed in any type of a mattress cover or anything like that.
Or a body bag?
Body bag. No, that body bag issue's come up so many times.
Well, what was used to line the
When
coffin?
you picked up the body, though, was it wrapped in sheets?
Yeah, he was
Just
completely
the
wrapped
way
in
that
sheets.
we
and-
normally,
Yeah,
with extra padding around the head.
yeah. The head was wrapped in sheets, and
Was the face covered?
face was completely covered. The only thing we could see was from the
Right.
throat.
That's
down.
what my recollection was. Is there was a bloody white sheet wrapped around.
Wrapped
the head.
totally around the
All right,
head.
but
Totally around the head.
But
couldn't-
as far
You
as
said
the-
that told me that a sheet that only extended halfway down his body, it was plasticized
Yeah.
or rubberized or something.
It was a sheet that they used for people who are extremely bloody or something like that, where they could move them immediately. They'd put on the cot when we'd bring them in. Shooting victim, accident victims, someone that's bleeding real bad. Or they also used it for bedwetting, but it was
Yeah.
a sheet, it was folded up, and it was in the cabinet,
Yeah.
same place where she got this gel.
And it only covered half of the body.
And all we did was put it up over the pillow and, kind of wrap it around the lining of the casket. It was a white lining.
Before the
and-
body went in.
Yeah, before the body went in.
Was it
And we didn't do that
plasticized or-
actually until after we had picked the body up to begin with, and then that's when I noticed that the blood was still coming out real
Was it
strong from his head.
plasticized or rubberized?
It was a rubberized type.
And what color was it?
It was a creamish white color.
Do you remember this when you received
No.
it?
When he arrived, or when he was brought into the morgue, and again I have to reiterate is the fact is that my knowledge is basically from morgue door into the morgue proper. He was wrapped in, if my memory serves me well, 2 sheets on the body, a sheet on the head area. They were all relatively bloody, and underneath the sheets on the head area, the head itself was wrapped in towels.
Paul, could you give quickly your background as a young man? I think you worked in funeral homes.
Yes, I
Did
did.
you have a lot of experience with bodies?
Yes.
And when you, your job normally at an autopsy was to remove the brain, is that correct?
Well, Mr. Jenkins
Among
and I usually, I'd work on one part of the body, he'd work on the other part of the body. When I got done, let's say, with the brain, I'd come around and help him. So we worked as a team that way.
Now, I realized that there was a lot of shock and so on. I mean, this was the President of the United States coming in, and you were young, but not that young. You were an 18-year-old enlisted man. I mean, you had considerable experience in funeral homes with dead bodies and this kind of thing. So you weren't overcome by shock. But you tell us, were you still pretty objective observers, let's say, but in your opinion, how much of the brain was left?
What I remember, there was about 2/3 of it missing, or macerated all the pieces.
And so there was about 1/3 of the brain left. In there.
About.
And was it on one side of the head or the other side?
Yeah, I remember it being on the left side.
On the left side. And was it attached to the brainstem, or?
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I have no idea.
Do you remember who removed the brain?
I don't remember anybody removing any brain at all. Usually, in order to remove the brain, you're going to have to saw the skull cap off. And that wasn't done that night.
And Floyd, what kind of a casket did the body arrive in?
Gray type metal shipping container.
What do you mean by a shipping container?
Well, shipping casket.
How much do they weigh?
100 pounds maybe.
60 to 100 pounds.
Yeah, somewhere
Could it
in
weigh
there.
60 pounds?
Could have.
What color was it?
Gray.
Gray?
Yeah.
Do you remember the casket?
No.
Paul, do you remember
Oh,
the
yes.
casket?
It was a pinkish gray.
Was
Pinkish
it,
gray casket.
when you say shipping casket, is this something it's not intended for a funeral or a ceremony?
Well,
or-
what we used to do when I was in the funeral business is if somebody died on the East Coast and they wanted to be buried on the West Coast, they'd be placed in one of these caskets and shipped across country.
Yeah, it's transportation.
Did you put the body in a casket?
Yes.
What kind of a casket was it?
It was a large, heavy metal casket.
Did
Probably
you,
weigh down 300 pounds. Empty.
300? Some estimates, I think, in William Manchester were 600 pounds.
Body and everything, probably get close
Yeah.
to 600.
And it was bronze?
Yeah.
And would you do you know what a shipping casket looks like?
Oh, yeah. I worked at a funeral home.
Yeah.
We shipped a lot of bodies.
You're a
out.
retired police, or you are a police officer. You are a retired police officer. That's right. So you feel confident that the body arrived in a shipping casket, which is entirely different from a ceremonial casket intended for funerals.
Yes.
This was a ceremonial casket he went out in.
Yeah.
She walked, I mean, I was right there. They walked out the door. She walked right behind her with her hand on top of it.
Right.
Could you describe the whole scene from the time you helped put the body in the casket?
Right. I had the head portion, and Dennis McGuire, my writer, had the bottom portion, and his hand would go here, mine would go just above here, and we'd pick him up straight, turn around, put him in the casket. We closed the lid, we sealed it, and then the priest blessed the casket and holy water and everything. Then he put a crucifix, had a
Were you
crucifix on
waiting
it.
before you put him in the coffin and sealed it? Had you been waiting for the priest?
Oh yeah, he had not had his last rites. No. That was
You waited what? How long?
probably 30, 40 minutes.
Is that right?
That's about right. I remember now that
Did anybody
there was
else come
something.
in the room, and were you all in the room the whole time, or one of the nurses or somebody? Could anybody have come in and tampered with the body at that time?
I would
I
say
was
no.
there during the last rites.
And was Mrs. Kennedy in that room, would you say, throughout the time?
Yes.
Yeah.
That you were waiting for the priest?
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
So that nobody could have come in and done anything,
No.
or put the body in a
No.
shipping
No way.
casket and taken him through the tunnel out of the hospital?
No, there's too many people around there.
Yeah.
No, I'm sure this probably been discussed elsewhere, but I recall vividly the casket being brought out of trauma room 1, and Earl Rose tried to push it back in. He said, "You can't take this body; it needs an autopsy under state law or something like that." And he was just surrounded by a bunch of Secret Service and FBI who didn't know each other, and he was slammed up against the wall, and that casket went right out the door.
So you put the lid on the coffin, and then would you tell what happened all the way to the airport?
Well, you know, from the beginning, like the doctor says, we started out of the trauma room with it, and anyway, someone says, "No, you're not taking it. No, you're not taking us out," and they pushed us back in. And Secret Service said, "Let's go." So they would push us out, and we finally got the thing out of the room and squared into the hallway. And I remember we went through maternity section, which we, ambulance drivers were never allowed in maternity section unless we was taking the bodies through.
Yeah.
And that was very unusual that we went that way. And when we would try, we would push the body, or I had the head of the casket, and Peanuts had the back, and Miss Kennedy was sitting on the right-hand side or left-hand side of the casket like this, had her hand on the back of the casket all the time.
From your, let me interrupt you a minute. From your observations of Mrs. Kennedy throughout the whole tragic scene at Parkland Hospital, can you visualize her at any time in the next several hours taking her hand off of that casket or leaving it alone unless some other very close, trusted friend was there to watch the casket? Or in your knowledge of the death of someone close, can you imagine the casket being alone at any time in the next few hours from those people who were very close to President Kennedy? From the way she had her hand on the coffin?
Of course, I really couldn't speculate on that. I was impressed with the fact that she was in total control of herself.
Yeah.
She wasn't sobbing, as I recall. She wasn't hysterical. She was in total control.
Yeah.
As if, and I've said this in the past in casual conversations with friends when they've asked me about it, as if she had practiced this time after time, knowing that this might happen. And that's obviously it.
The only time I really saw any tears was when she first come in the room after they cleaned the body up and everything. We had already taken the casket in, and I believe that was the first time that she had come in the room outside of the time that she first come in the room when they brought him in, and I think the doctors and everything had moved her on out.
She was right outside.
We had taken a patient to we had taken 2 major medicine, and one had put him in one of the stalls going into X-ray. One of the stalls right there by the room going into the X-ray, and outside of, when the Secret Service come up and told us to go put a clean sheet on the casket and on the cot, bring it back in. He called it a gurney, and bring it back in and said we was going to transfer the president to St. Paul because he's a Catholic. And when I first saw him bring him in, I didn't think there was any chance the man was going to live to begin with, because they had his head completely covered with a coat.
Yeah.
And Miss Kennedy was walking behind it. And I heard doctors say something about they thought Miss Kennedy had some brain in her hand when she come in.
How long did this struggle last in the hallway with the Secret Service and Dr. Rose?
I'd say it took us 10 to 12 minutes to get him from trauma room number 1 to the hearse.
It was an ordinary hearse, right?
Yeah, it was a regular hearse.
And then what happened?
Well, there was people struggling. The state authorities wanted this casket, they wanted the body to stay in Dallas for the autopsy, which is state law. They have to do an autopsy on a shooting victim, murder victim. And the Secret Service, or federal people, wanted the body taken out immediately.
Did you follow the ambulance after it left? I mean,
the hearse, yeah. We followed the procession. There was probably 15 or 20 cars, probably 10 or 12 motorcycle escorts.
Going where?
Well, we left Parkland, went out on Harry Hines on out to Mockingbird, and on into Love Field.
And were there any stop anywhere at the O'Neill's funeral home? Or?
No, I've heard that story before.
We're trying to settle this question. All right.
Let me ask a couple questions. Did you remember a lot of commotion down there, a lot of confusion? Not among the medical personnel, but it seemed like, as I recall, there were federal people who didn't know who the Secret Service were, or FBI who didn't know.
There was a lot of pushing and shoving going on.
Absolutely, there was.
You're really terrified because these people have cursed you and, threatened you in every way possible. They're going to whip your ass one way or another, and you open your mouth, I'll, knock you down, teeth down your throat.
Did you see their hands going in their coats?
I saw one deal, I've heard about the gun routine, but I saw one time that a guy in a suit did put his hand inside the coat for somebody to back off. There's a lot of cussing.
So the hearse went directly to Love Field, and you followed it. You were right behind it?
No, we were approximately a good city block behind it. We was running with red lights and siren on me, trying to keep
Code
up
what?
with it.
What is the code?
Code 3.
Code three.
You know,
So
we got
you-
in behind it. You
But
know.
you can say categorically that there were no detours or the ambulance, the hearse did not.
None whatsoever.
Stop
Outside
it.
of going, it went straight to the airport,
So
straight
you
to the airplane.
Are sure, and I'm not trying to put words in your mouth, but are you sure absolutely that that body did not get diverted before it got to the plane?
No, I'm absolutely sure.
Pardon me?
I'm absolutely sure.
All right, and did you see it go onto the tarmac and into the plane, the
Yeah.
coffin?
Well, the hearse was parked right by the stairways going up to the plane.
All right.
And,
Let me ask you, gentlemen, do you have some questions for Dr. McClellan on the wounds, in particular the head wounds, with regard to the state of these pictures that we have been looking at here that seem to have something pretty drastically wrong? But would you, and if you folks would like to question them, I hope that it hasn't all been put out of your head while we've talked about other things, but I would appreciate it if anything at all that comes to mind that you have wanted to know about.
My first question is, what happened to the coffin? Let me ask you, what happened to the coffin that O'Neill supplied? Did they ever get it returned, or were they ever paid for it?
I know they was paid for it, but Mr. O'Neill went to Washington. I know I took him out the airport twice, and I know somebody else took him out one time before, where he was going up and try. He wanted the casket back more than he wanted the money, because he figured he could make a few bucks off that casket, and he wanted that casket back real bad.
Did he ever get it back?
Not while I was working there. I left in 1964.
Dr. McClellan, you must have some question about this autopsy. Unfortunately, we don't have the doctors. There's only 5 people, in my experience, and as you know, I've been investigating this for a long time. There's only 5 people that will not talk to anybody about this and never have. One of them is here, and we know who that is, and I respect him. But we have a problem with the 4 autopsy doctors who absolutely refuse all these years to talk to anybody. And of course, we know beyond any question that certain critical matters were not only lied about or fudged in the autopsy report, I should say fudged, but lied about. Specifically, we know that at the autopsy, nobody there knew that the president had been shot in the throat. Nobody there knew that. Is that right? Okay. All they saw was this incision, which we've seen in the photographs. So then we get an autopsy report that states that this is an exit wound from a bullet. Well, we also know what an exit wound looks like and what the edges of an exit wound look like. Would you in any way say that this photograph shows the edges of an exit wound?
Not on the high-powered bullet.
No.
Mm-hmm. This is Exhibit D.
What struck me about that wound in his throat was it was actually a lot bigger than a normal tracheostomy. And that's what I remember about it.
I first thought it was an exit wound until the nurse said that they did a trach on him. And
The large defect that you saw in the head or know about, and some of this would be hearsay that you heard from the other doctors, but would you typify this as an exit wound that you saw in the back of the head?
It's what it looked like to me.
Yeah, that's what it looked like to me. And what I'm basing my judgment on is that the summer before I went to Bethesda, I was again in the military, and I was stationed at a dispensary in Cecil Field, Florida. I had the duty one night, and we were called to the gate saying that one of our sailors had been shot. Well, we went to the gate. There was an individual in the back seat of the car that was dressed all in white. I went to pull him out of the car, and my left hand actually went inside the skull cavity. He had wounds not identical to, but similar to what I've seen here, or what I saw at Bethesda. We later found that this was not an individual from the military, that it was actually an apprentice butcher that had been rustling his brother-in-law's cows, butchering them, and he and a friend had been selling them. His brother-in-law had actually shot him through the right front window of the pickup truck, or the truck that they were using to transport the meat. And and of course, before he got to main site, which is the main Air Force Base hospital there, he was dead. Again, the wounds that I observed there were similar to the wounds that I observed here. The other thing with the wounds, and again relating back to conversation, was that where the flap area is on the scalp.
You mean this?
Yes. I remember
Exhibit B.
that the flap area was more attached and hinged a little bit more to the top of the skull, and the fact is that it would actually come up a little bit.
So
Now,
you're saying that this photograph is inaccurate with regard to that?
well, I'm not really sure, because I'm not orientating real well on this. But there was a discussion in the autopsy about some graying areas on the bone anterior in front of this flap, where the wound actually looked like it started. Now, when I say started, the areas like Paul had drawn, those areas were still fragmented. The skull was still broken up at that point in time, but most of the damage the noticeable damage was anterior or toward the back of the skull at that time. I remember Dr. Fink making a statement, could this possibly be from a bullet? And, it was examined as such, things of that nature. And, again, I'd like to say, probably when the official report of the autopsy came out, I was stunned.
Were you sent to Vietnam at any time?
I'm not allowed to answer that.
Were you, either of you sent to Vietnam?
Yes, I was.
How many times were you sent to Vietnam?
Just once.
Were you at any time in either in an area where you could have got killed, or?
I was in combat, got wounded.
But you were trained as a medical technician.
Combat medical technician.
Yeah.
And how many times were you in Vietnam for? 3 times. Did you think there was anything peculiar about your trips to Vietnam?
Well, the only thing I thought peculiar is a lot of people weren't being sent over that could have been. Why me?
I could have
I
felt
mean, one time I could go along with that.
Did you gentlemen think that there was anything funny about this autopsy at the time you were in the autopsy?
I really didn't relate anything that was going on to being out of the usual. It was the conclusion and the conversations that I remember. God. Could I entertain a question? Maybe they'll focus again.
Now, both of y'all were the deniers at Bethesda in the morgue. Is that correct?
Well, I think that's an appropriate terminology,
Well,
because what we were is
You're
Paul and I were both in the medical school there in laboratory sciences. Our duty station was.
Let's just start over again.